the greatest American philosopher of all time, John Dewey. So what I want to do is begin by asking what we think democracy is. I think before we question the virtue of democracy or the possibility of democracy, we should become clearer than people normally are about what it means to be a democracy. Of course, the democracy that Plato criticized is very different from the democracies that take on that title in the world today. They would be regarded by Plato and by his contemporaries as rather peculiar sorts of oligarchies, where it's not families ruling generation after generation, but a replacement of a small group of individuals who rule the state. But one thing I want to do from the very beginning is acknowledge something which I think is very clear in Plato, but drops out of sight in the last few centuries. And that is that democracy is something that can occur at a number of different levels. We tend to think of democracies as whole states, individual nations. And that isn't the only type of human decision-making process or human group activity to which a term like democracy can become applicable. So let's first start off by asking what democracy is. Well, many people give a standard response to this, and it's probably a response that some of you might well offer me if I could talk to you and ask you. Well, a democratic state is one in which there are elections and everybody can vote, or all the adults can vote, and maybe there have to be a few more conditions. There have to be several candidates. The votes can't be coerced in any way. And that's a democracy. Now, I don't think that that's enough. For the original and deep idea behind democracy, which excites people about this form of government and makes them enthusiastic for it, or in Churchill's memorable phrase, say that it's the worst of all forms of government except for all the others. What I think entices people to be Democrats in political spirit is the thought that by the exercise of voting, you express your own freedom. That is, if the leaders that you currently have don't match the kinds of policies and interests that you are devoted to, you can recall them, you can get rid of them. So this is a kind of motivation that Plato understood very well. In the Republic, he tells us that the friends of democracy will plead in its behalf that it's an expression of human freedom. But that freedom is profoundly contingent on something. And it's contingent, as Plato indeed saw, on the ability of those who vote to recognize where their interests lie. And I think when we take that idea seriously, we realize that it's a very hard thing for a group of citizens in a large and complex contemporary state to make up their minds about a whole range of issues, many of which involve all sorts of technical concepts and technical discussions. We might think that in order to be fully informed on the full range of issues of any contemporary multicultural state in the world today, you'd have to spend virtually all your time on politics, and that might not even be enough. Now, John Stuart Mill in the 19th century thought that there was a clear answer to this problem. And Mill added to the bare notion of democracy as involving voting and elections another theme which I think of as being very important, namely the idea that the voters are informed through the free and open discussions of the issues that concern them. And so Mill envisaged this forum in which people debate, and they present to the citizens of a political unit their positions on the issues of the day, the issues that arise for those citizens. And the citizens are then supposed to be able to see where their interests lie, and thus be able to support candidates who really will answer to their interests. So in Mill's version, it's highly idealized. It really is very utopian. I like to think of it this way. Imagine a company of impeccably scrupulous Victorian gentlemen who proceed to the microphone and take their turns and always speak sincerely and never attack one another in an underhanded or vicious way, but retreat after they have had their turn, always answer questions truthfully, confess the difficulties with their positions, and so on and so forth. That's the sort of free and open debate that Mill envisaged as an ideal. And it's obviously not the way in which we live now, with not only news media competing for audiences and sometimes skewing the transmission of information to what they think their readers or viewers are going to want to believe, but also sometimes ignoring some issues completely. And then we have the phenomenon of the internet and the ways in which people become divided into groups who talk to one another, who listen to information that they find congenial, presented in ways that fit their prior prejudices and views. So this seems to undermine completely the ways in which this operation is supposed to work. And it leads, and this I think is a genuine concern about contemporary democracy, it leads to a state of affairs in which people can go to the polls and vote for candidates. And in this action, which is supposed to express their freedom, pick people and parties who are in fact diametrically opposed to their interests. Let me give you an example of this. It comes. I'm sorry. Am I inaudible or something?
No, you're perfectly audible.
Okay.
I just need to mute people because they don't.
I'm hearing another voice.
Yeah. That's our fault. I have fixed it. Sorry.
And I thought it might be somebody trying to give me a message, so I wanted to listen. Okay, so let me give you an example from the contemporary world. Here we have an enormous pan-national problem, the problem of climate change, even larger than the problem posed to the contemporary world by the COVID virus. Now, how are we to solve this problem? Well, we might think that the democracies of the world will elect policymakers committed to deal with it in some way or another. But many people in many parts of the world vote again and again and again against any kinds of policies that will increase the speed at which we make a transition to a sustainable world. Why did they do that? These are not typically people who want future generations to suffer. These are not people who don't care about their children and grandchildren. They do. But they are so concerned with certain other issues that again and again, they sacrifice the interests of people they deeply love and care about to short-term gains, to short-term desires of theirs. And that's because they are badly misinformed. We've seen the same thing with all sorts of other issues. It occurred most notably in my original homeland over Brexit, where voters were explicitly told by a then member of the cabinet that they shouldn't listen to experts anymore. We've had too much of experts in this country, Michael Gove famously said. So there is a deep problem about how the citizenry becomes informed enough to express democratic freedom. Now, we might think of democracy, as I've depicted it so far, as having two levels. There's a superficial level at which people vote, there are elections, there are some candidates, and there's no coercion that's going on, or perhaps not too much coercion that's going on. And then beneath that, there's the level at which the citizens become informed so that their voting behavior can express what they truly and deeply want. But I think this two-tier picture is insufficient. I think there's a much deeper level of democracy. And for that, I'm going to go back to two authors. The first is Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a very famous study of American democracy in the early 19th century. What impressed de Tocqueville most about his visit to the United States was not the fact that there were elections and votes. What really impressed him as the core of American democracy were the town meetings of New England, meetings in which people came together and tried to work out what they would do collectively by listening and learning from one another. And that thought is taken up by John Dewey in, I think, a great book, a truly great book, Democracy and Education, in which Dewey says, democracy and education aren't linked in some sort of artificial or sort of tenuous way. They are deeply entwined. And that's because democracy itself is a kind of living together, a form of life in which people live together and work out and solve their problems together through listening and learning from one another. That idea, that Deweyan idea, I think has gotten lost in contemporary democracy. And many of the ills of contemporary democracy stem from the polarization of the electorate and the fragmentation of the news media and sources of information. Now, you might say this is really utopian. This is where democracy gets truly utopian. How can you possibly have, in an enormous state with many, many different perspectives and many different factions, how can you have that kind of democracy in which citizens communicate? And I agree, this is an ideal. And ideals, in my view, are best seen not as depictions of a utopia towards which we should aim, but rather as diagnostic tools that tell us what is wrong with our current state and point us in directions in which we can do better. I am not a perfectionist. I am, like Dewey, somebody who thinks that what we need to do is make progress from the current situation, to ameliorate it, to improve it, to make it better. And the ideal of Deweyan democracy with this kind of joint conversation is one, it seems to me, that points us in the right kinds of directions for making progress with democracy. So let me elaborate this by taking up a point I advertised earlier, but then inexplicably dropped. And that's the thought that democracy is something that occurs at a number of different levels and a number of different scales. So de Tocqueville focused on small communities. Communities actually that were often facing common problems in a harsh environment. But I'm going to start even smaller than that. We can talk about democracy with respect to the family. Throughout human history, probably, most families have been highly autocratic. They've been dominated by a single individual. So, for example, in the early 17th century, it did not seem wrong or a usurpation of power in any way for a very prominent English lawyer, Sir Edward Coke, to compel his daughter to marry the man of his choice. And that man was the somewhat mentally disturbed brother of a British aristocrat. His daughter was 14. She refused. Coke took her, tied her to a bedpost, and whipped her until she consented. Now, that kind of heavy-handed use of power is probably on the extreme side, but it is nonetheless true that for many families, until relatively recently, one member of the family, typically the father, but sometimes an older patriarch in the family, had the dominant voice and others had to listen. Many families these days are much more democratic than that. Husbands and wives work out things together when the children are very little, and when the children get a little bit more advanced, they join in the conversation. Now, one thing about this form of democracy is, I think you'll agree, that voting is entirely out of place in it. This is a democracy that is really not about voting at all. How many of you, with respect to your families, would feel happy if whenever you had a decision to make, an email went out with, here are the options. When we get together, I want you to choose your option. Then you all come together and the votes are tallied, and that's that. That's not the way families are supposed to work. And that's because we cherish a view of the family as a unit in which people listen and learn from one another. So I'm going to suggest a model for a kind of conversation. When there's an issue that affects a group of people, that issue should be discussed by representatives of all the perspectives found in the group that will be affected by it. It should be inclusive in that sense. Second, it should be as well informed as possible. And third, and this is perhaps the most important condition of all, the participants in the discussion should be mutually engaged with one another. That is, they try to figure out what the perspectives of one another are, to try to sympathize with those perspectives and to see the world from them. In other words, they try to enter into the lives of their fellows, and through doing that, to try to work towards an outcome that everybody can accept. Families do this. Towns in New England could do this, and perhaps even today in communities all around the world. Local communities do it. There have been experiments in doing this sort of thing. And the challenge for us is to scale it all up, to scale it up to the level of the nation and to scale it up to the level of the world. Now, how can we possibly do that? Well, Emmanuel Macron in France has taken some steps in this direction with Le Grand Débat. And whatever the value of that particular experiment, it can be conducted under different conditions all around the world. We can try to see if we can form groups of dissimilar people and bring them into harmony through mutual discussion with one another, and then combine the groups together. This could be done electronically or in person. And so get a sense of a grassroots national policy that emerges. This would be a kind of venture in democracy that in certain respects echoes the original Athenian notion. It's much more inclusive, of course, but it's also one that develops this Deweyan idea of democracy as a way of life. Now, as I said, these experiments are going on in places all around the world. And they can be enhanced by thinking very hard about what the conditions on participation should be. We don't want perspectives to be represented by people who come to the discussion completely inflexibly, determined to preserve their position come what may. Those people are bad participants in this kind of democratic discussion. We need also, perhaps, not only a social institutionalization of this form of democracy, but we also need some changes with respect to education. Perhaps one of the most important parts of children's education, from the time they first go to school, at 3 or 4 or 5, is to have them learn how to respond to one another in groups and make joint decisions with one another. In a forthcoming book about education generally, I've outlined a program for trying to do something like this, which will generate, I hope, people who are more clearly fellow citizens with one another. But the hardest thing of all is going to be to develop this on a global scale, because there are problems that we all human beings, and not just those who live now, but those who come in the future, are involved in. There are problems that will affect all of us. And the most prominent of those is the one to which I've already referred, namely climate change. Now, it is, I think, a welcome thing about the world today that there are people like Greta Thunberg who are ready to go out and to campaign for climate action in the hopes that she and members of her generation may not suffer a totally harsh environment as they age. But that is only part, I think, of the story. Greta Thunberg speaks to the young, and the young are, in general, perhaps for self-interested reasons, but perhaps because they genuinely recognize the force of the problem, more willing to participate in climate activism. But there are many people in the world today who feel incredibly vulnerable and worry that a swift transition to renewable sources of energy would so disrupt their lives that they would find themselves suffering really severe hardships. The importance of the kind of Deweyan community that I've stressed is that it begins with the assurance that all are to be protected, that a solution in which people's lives are ruined is a non-solution. And so we come, I think, to the most difficult and deep problem of all, which is the problem of the fact that we no longer live in a world in which experts are taken seriously, in which there are clear and uncontested sources of information. And that means that our communities who are trying to work together need also to learn how to inquire together. They need to find ways in which they can, starting from very different perspectives, begin to engage in joint learning by discovering and debating with one another about who is to be trusted and whose views are not to be recognized as authoritative in any way. The working out of the norms for that kind of social activity seems to me the heart of that part of philosophy that has traditionally been called epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. We have been, you have been, all of us have been brought up on a highly individualistic view of knowledge, in which we think about knowledge as something which is acquired by an individual, usually from scratch, complete and utter myth. We are socially conditioned and socially shaped from the very beginning. And we lose sight of what is, I think, the most crucial problem for any knower. Whom should I trust? Whose views have authority on this issue? And what is urgently needed is a form of epistemology that can make sense of the idea of joint inquiry into debated and complex issues. So I will close in a minute, but before I do so, let me say I fear I have sounded awfully utopian. But I have been occupied for the last part of my philosophical career with a large number of problems that center on this kind of issue, the issue of how we work together to make as much progress as we can. To repeat, I'm not a believer in perfection, but I am a believer in making progress by recognizing the problems that confront us. And the principal task of philosophy is to provide frameworks, I think, for doing that. And my writings in the last decade have been an attempt to do that. And democracy and a particular idea of democracy lies at the very heart of them. Thank you very much.
All right, I thank Mr. Kitcher. So I'm going to ask all the participants that wish to ask a question to please raise their hand and we'll ask them. But while we do so, perhaps I will lead with a question of my own, if I may. And that is the question of a ever complex world that we live in. It seems my background is more in the field of political science than strictly philosophy. And to me, it seems that often the counterpoint to any kind of proposal for a more direct approach to democracy than what we are used to is often met with the question, well, is it possible in a world as complex as ours to have a direct participation by citizens who cannot perhaps even be, asked to devote as much time as is necessary to understand the issues that they would be voted on? So could you perhaps quickly touch on that, and then we go to the questions of the audience?
It's a very good question, and it is, of course, very difficult. But if we can all agree on experts, then it will be possible for the experts to come in and explain those issues. That's surely one thing that we used to think we could rely on. Okay, here are these demarcated experts. Have them come in and explain simply and clearly what the issue is about, what the constraints are, and so on and so forth. Now, I think this can be done actually with respect to climate change and climate science if you want to designate the experts. The problem then comes at the earlier stage that people say, the person you're thinking of as expert doesn't know anything. This person over here who has a completely different opinion is really the authority. That's the situation for which we need this kind of joint inquiry. And that's why I ended as I did, with the thought that the crucial epistemological problem is to try to set up norms for joint inquiry. How do we figure out how, when the experts are disputed, we figure out together which are the real ones? Now, in fact, the kinds of experiments in collective discussion to which I've been referring have, until quite recently, been able to bring in expertise in order to agreed on expertise in order to inform the participants in those discussions. And there may be some cases in which the issues are really technical. And in those cases, what we are going to need is an educational system that produces people not who are specialists in any particular science or any particular area of knowledge, but people who are capable of exerting their intelligence to think carefully and clearly and critically about all sorts of things when they are in the presence of somebody who actually knows all the details. This can be done. I mean, I've done a fair bit of work in my philosophy of science past and trying to make certain kinds of issues crystal clear to people. And I don't think I've always failed.
Right, thank you very much. And now we have the first question from the audience, from Nelly. Please ask your question.
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. And I'd like to ask, well, as you know, according to Aristotle, there are 6 forms of ruling, and they are grouped by bad or good and by the number of people who rule. So Aristotle tells that the best among the good ones is the monarchy. Nonetheless, I'm rather interested which is the worst from the worst. So, do you think that even the autocracy, the power of the crowd, is even in this case is better than the other, or not better but less bad than the other 2 bad forms, oligarchy and tyranny?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is no serious question about the difficulty of having government in the person of a few. I mean, let's go back to Plato again. I mean, I think Aristotle was coming to this after Plato. And I think he probably had in mind the same sort of idea that Plato had. It takes you 50 years to become a proper guardian of the city. And the problem that Plato has, of course, is that he wants these people not only to be wise, but he also wants them to be good. And it's a master stroke of Plato's metaphysics to equate becoming good with getting to know the form of the good. So in becoming a certain kind of wise person, you automatically become incorruptible on Plato's account. But I think the dangers of corruption are always there if you restrict the number of rulers. And democracy is imperfect, and people do get things wrong. But if they approach one another in the spirit of Deweyan democracy, that they're in this together, the reverberations of those errors are not going to be so painful and are not going to cause as much suffering. So I'm going to push back against Aristotle here and say, I think actually he, like Plato before him, is guilty of a sort of fascination with the perfected individual. The perfected individual doesn't exist, but with orientation towards one another and commitment to one another, we can, for all our faults and all our individual shortcomings, do better together. So who's going to ask the next question?
Yeah, sorry, I just failed unmuting myself. Okay, next question is by Dimitris.
Hello, thank you for your lecture, first of all. I would like to ask a question regarding political parties, because their role in modern democracies is fundamental, because they are actually the organization, the structures through which public opinion is supposed to translate to political decisions. I would like to answer, what are your thoughts about whether the structure of political parties should change, because I believe that as they are constituted today, there's not enough communication and not enough feedback when it comes to the supporters of the party towards the leader and the representatives. And so instead of the people actually setting the pace and promoting their ideas, I think that it goes vice versa. For example, they get molded into a particular program, political program that has been predetermined. And I would like to hear your opinions about that, and whether we could fix it, reorganize political parties, maybe an alternative, and how that would work.
You've made some terrific points. I agree with you completely. Political parties, by and large, have gotten into the business of organizing themselves so they can remain in power as long as possible. And this is taken to absurd limits by the current Republican Party in the United States. I mean, it's prepared to do absolutely anything to remain in power. Now, what we need, I think, are institutional mechanisms to restore communication between the citizens whom the parties are supposed to serve and the representatives and the members of the party. And so I would envisage a far more regulated state with respect to what political parties can and cannot do, and far more scrutiny of how they break the existing rules as well. But that would be combined with the idea of this grassroots movement that begins with democracy on the small scale, that feeds in, so that the parties themselves know that their fate actually really depends on their listening to the people, the citizens as a whole. So thank you very much. It's a terrific question, and it's a I think it's a very important issue for working out the details of the kind of social introduction of Deweyan democracy that I envisage.
Okay, next question by Juan Cruz Mendoza.
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. My question was, what would be the place of science in this discussion? Would it be like could it be a common ground from which we can have political discussions and dialogues? Could it be useful for political discussions? For example, many of political discussions nowadays are based on science because, well, for the COVID and medicine and everything like that. What your thoughts would be about that?
Okay, well, I'm smiling because 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Science, Truth, and Democracy, in which I started to investigate the ways in which science should interact with society. And that was born of having been somebody who I was called in by the Library of Congress in the 1990s and asked to write a report on the implications of the Human Genome Project. And that got me involved in understanding the ways in which politics, the channels of communication between politics and science were not always good. And so from that time on, I've been very concerned that science should play a proper and informative role in, especially in the technical issues that concern people. The trouble is that things have gotten, in some respects, far worse since I wrote that book. It's not simply the case that scientists don't always respond appropriately to the problems of the age that beset various people. It's also the case that you can't just say, oh, here are the scientists, let's listen to them on this issue. It doesn't work that way anymore, partly because of the way in which scientists themselves get credit. There are incentive structures for scientists to, who are not doing great research, to start campaigning that the mainstream, the orthodox view is wrong. And those can then be picked up by people who want to say, see, I like the political implications of what they say. We're seeing that a lot. We've seen it with respect to the pandemic, at least in Britain and in the United States, and possibly in other places as well. We've seen it again and again and again with respect to climate change. The idea that there are experts who oppose the climate consensus. And this is why the idea of joint inquiry into establishing the expertise of science is so important. So you're completely right. This is a very significant role that has to be played. But unfortunately, we no longer live in a world in which we can say, oh, I'm a scientist, listen to me, and it will happen. Even very basic things these days are called into question. I wish that weren't so, but it's a large part of the problem. But thank you.
Thank you to you.
All right, next up we have Hendrik.
Hi, and thank you for your lecture. I'm not quite sure if it's rather a question or a comment, and I'm not quite sure what I want to say with it, but sometimes I feel that democracy is used as a tool that gives the majority the impression that they have an impact, so they don't start to rebel in a kind of a way. So in fact, we don't really have like a democracy where everyone can, when they really have an interest, they really can change something, but it still works as, I don't know, a tool that people still stay happy enough to don't rebel. Aren't you afraid that when you start to change the concept and start to, well, make it like possible for everyone to understand how democracy works and maybe to be more connected with democracy, that people might rebel more in some way? I don't know. It's a weird question. I don't know, but maybe you.
yeah, it's a serious question. So your poor people who are getting hit with democracy as a tool of oppression are being sold a bill of goods. What typically happens is they're being told that they live in a democracy when they really don't. I think there are many, many, many places in the world that are advertised as being democratic, but that have forsaken democracy completely. And I do want to focus on one thing you said. You said if you change the concept of democracy, aren't you going to loosen things up in this terrible way, and people are going to rebel and so on and so forth? I want to say, no, that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm actually giving you what democracy has always striven to be. I mean, it always was this way at bottom, but we have become fixated on the superficial machinery. And somebody like Viktor Orban or Erdogan or Donald Trump can say, you know, I'm presiding over a democracy. And the truth of the matter is it's fallen off. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, here's a set of tools that will enable you to diagnose what's gone wrong in the hopes that we can put some of it right. Not all of it right. Again, I'll say it again, I'm not a perfectionist, but we can start to make things better. That's the hope. I liked the comment, and I think you're right about the ways in which people have sometimes sold a bill of goods. But I'm sort of saying, let's go back to what this is really all about. Democracy isn't just a matter of elections.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Next up is Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, but I really couldn't not question with the problem that you're trying to portray, if it really is how you say it is, and I'd like you to kind of comment on the mechanism that I think actually is there. If that's all right. So basically what I'm thinking is that democracy as a system, and without the problems that might occur, is actually the most utilitarian way of providing the most good to the people. And there will be problems how people are not fully informed in the choices that they are making. And what I'm thinking is that there are still ways in which we can inform, and there are still, we still create non-commercial organizations. There is a possibility that, for example, parties that are in clash and they're trying to win an election or have some more support, they can create controversies and some sort of discourses in order to make people feel more involved and more likely to vote for them. And I think that the biggest problem why we do not have any very popular discourses about, for example, environmental changes, why politicians will discard scientists, is mostly because of lobbyism, because large companies will pay, the politicians will donate to their parties in order for them to not talk about environmental changes, in order for the companies to be able to continue on doing harm to the environment. So isn't a simpler mechanism to find a way to extinguish that and to let these mechanisms that we have already in place as democratic mechanisms to provide people with enough information to vote in how they think that the world should move on? Isn't that a simpler mechanism in order to kind of fix this problem in democracy, in order to make people more informed? Because probably the problem is not that they don't want to know, is that they do not have the resources to know, because there is this kind of wall that makes politicians and other people who can actually provide this information not do that. Thank you.
So I agree.
Before you answer, sorry, Mr. Kitcher, let's try and keep the questions as short as possible so that as many people as possible can ask them. But please do answer.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. I think you've hit a very good point, which is the great importance of keeping money and bribery out of politics. There's far too much of that that's been going on. And part of my program, and this is again outlined in a book that will appear in November about the education, is that there has to be a fair bit of adjustment already of the economic structures of society. Now, you put this in a way that I think is interesting. You said, well, isn't this an easier way to go? And I think actually, no. I think it's a harder way to go, because I think in order to get those kinds of economic changes that are needed, you actually have to put in place this idea of a community of fellow citizens. I think without that concept, without the feeling that we belong together as a community of fellow citizens, then you won't get reform on the economic issues in the way that it's needed. So I guess you and I disagree. I mean, we both see the need for economic change. That seems to me pretty clear. So I think you're right about that, but I just don't think it's easier to do that until you've, as it were, built up what Dewey called in The Public and Its Problems, the great community. But thank you for the question.
All right, thank you for the answer. Next up is Nina.
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can now see you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, it's just because, yeah, okay. It's because I have two questions. And the first one is sort of a classic question. It's about the efficiency of sort of this participatory democracy that you're talking about. In Denmark, there's not a philosopher, but a social scientist who sort of advocated this participatory democracy. And the problem was that it wasn't very efficient because the criteria for decisions being made was that everyone should read consensus. And I think that's very difficult. I'm sort of disregarding the possibility that we have an education system that would sort of encourage that in the future. I'm more thinking about the present situation and sort of the transition into a completely democratic world. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that. And also I have another point which I just got thinking about when you were talking. It was if we are to make these citizen councils or something like it, don't we risk that they become sort of in relation to their participants sort of biased? I'm so sorry. Because the people who would volunteer to take part in them, wouldn't they already be people who'd like or who sort of take the pragmatic approach to politics and who'd like to find solutions together? And I think the risk there is that the people who actually need to find the decisions legitimate would be the people who most likely don't find the pragmatic approach very appropriate. So don't you risk actually getting a democracy that might be very representative of the people who want to participate in it on beforehand, but not the people who actually perhaps need to gain a more pragmatic worldview? Okay,
very good second point. There are all sorts of dangers in this, and you've hit on one of them. I would prefer a system in which, just as we're all vulnerable to being called for jury duty, we're vulnerable to be called for service on one of these on one of these councils. So it's not a matter of volunteering; it's a matter of giving up time when you're asked to do so. And just as with jurors, you look out for people who are biased and hopelessly dogmatic and so on and so forth. But apart from that, everybody serves. Okay, now back to the first point. Inefficient it may be. We can try to make it more efficient in various ways. It's not obvious that some of the better experiments in this kind of deliberation have been so inefficient. But I want to say efficiency isn't everything. I mean, I think we've been captivated for the last 40 years at least by a particular model of society, which says we've got to maximize economic efficiency over everything else. But what I'm actually talking about is a complex human relational good, the good of being a fellow citizen with one another. And that, I think, is really important to cultivate. So I'm going to go back to something that Alexandra said and that I didn't comment on when I answered her question, which is that the purpose of a democratic government is to do as much good for everybody as if it were a kind of utilitarian enterprise. I don't think about it that way. I think about it as a system in which nobody's interests get slighted and ignored, that we listen to everybody. Now, you made a very good point about consensus. So I'm going to distinguish various levels of consensus. So strong consensus. We all agree on one option as being the best. Weaker consensus. We don't agree what the best is, but we all agree that we all think of certain options as acceptable, and there is some one option that belongs to all of our acceptable lists of options. So there's something that we can all tolerate. Weaker still. Sometimes people's interests and people's wishes have to be overridden, but it must be in such a way that they can see the sequence of decisions in which their policymakers participate as one that doesn't always penalize them. They must find the record of decisions acceptable. So you can weaken this in various ways and still make progress towards creating the kind of Deweyan community that I envisage. I hope that helps.
All right, so my suggestion is that we'll take one more quick question, and then we'll take a quick couple of minutes break before Mr. Aslan continues with his lecture. So I would like to ask Frederick, ask the last question, and please make it brief so that we don't cut into Mr. Aslan time.
Hang on, before we have this question, those of you who would like to ask me other questions, please feel free to email me. I'm very easy to find. My email address is easy to find at Columbia. So if you've got further questions, don't hesitate to write to me.
Can I speak now? Okay, so I'm gonna put two quick and simple questions. So do you think some levels of direct democracy should be implemented ideally? And if yes, then how much, if on the city level or even the nation level? And do you think we should implement different voting systems in the sense that now we mostly vote one candidate or one party, but instead we could devise systems where we perhaps select a few preferred candidates or parties and select, maybe have a negative vote to select candidates or parties which we really do not prefer.
Okay, I'll address the second one first. I'm a big fan of the Condorcet voting scheme of preference rank voting, where you have a number of choices and you rank them, and then what you do is as people drop out their votes, if I vote for a candidate who is eliminated as the worst, then my second choice votes get added to the candidate whom I picked as second. So, okay, the first question is very interesting. So you make it sound as though we try to figure out in advance what levels of democracy or what scales of democracy we want to institute. It seems to me that that depends very much on the problem. So we need international democracy to deal with things like pandemics and climate change. These are things that in the former case, the case of the pandemic, affect all living people. So that sets a population and it sets a level at which this discussion has to occur. When we think about climate change, that affects future people as well. So they have to be represented in the discussion. They're not here to speak for themselves, but they can be represented just as non-human animals, just as the demented, just as the sick, just as the old can be represented. So what I want to say is that there are some problems that have a huge scale. There are other problems that have a very small scale. And we should try to work out ways of introducing democracy at the appropriate scale to the problem. So it's not a matter of saying, well, let's start off with the town and see if we can do it there. But for some problems, it will be the town. And for some problems, it will be the province or perhaps some scattered group. We don't necessarily have to respect geographical boundaries here. But the people who are, as it were, affected by a problem, what you have to do to be inclusive is to represent all the perspectives of that population. Now that doesn't necessarily mean getting them all involved. It means having them all represented. And you can represent either at a fine grain or a coarse grain. Sometimes you'll lump perspectives together. You know, this person and this other person disagree on all sorts of details, but their fundamental take on this problem is this. And so they get one representative, as it were. So there are all sorts of ways in which one can try to work this out and to implement it along those lines. But the thing to start off with is not to say, well, we do it at one single level. No, it's got to be related to the form of the problem you're trying to solve. Well, thank you all very much for some terrific questions. I tried to answer them, and it was great. It was most enjoyable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kitcher, for this excellent lecture and the excellent answers to the questions of our participants. Thank you again for your cooperation with the scheduling and everything. So I propose now that we take a quick 2-minute break so that everyone can perhaps go to the toilet, maybe get something to drink, etc. And then we continue with Mr. Eslun's lecture. I will stop the recording.